So hopefully you have paused or switched between videos and had a chance to think about this. And this is something to really pick up in a session if we manage to get an online session to discuss. The idea is really to look at one of these markets and then thinking as economists, if you think there is gendered, because I'd be interested to hear if anybody said zero. Some people have said zero for milk in the past, and there's another one someone said zero for credit. And the most gendered ones people usually say are things like cosmetics, beer, the people you think on sports, news, people say it's gendered. Anyway, however you've rated it, a suggested next step is as economists to think about it, okay, why is it gendered? Is it gendered because of the supply side, people producing and offering this stuff, or is it gendered because of what people want, the demand side? Or are there gendered effects in both of those? Once you've decided to look at supply or demand, then thinking back on all the concepts we discussed so far in the lecture and any other explanations you have, why is it? What's driving that gendered supply or gendered demand in this market? Okay. Now we're going to move on to a brief section on measurements. So this is how we get empirically some evidence about the outcomes and why these outcomes of economic processes could be gendered. So economic analysis relies on measurement. I mean, if you enjoyed your econometrics so far, then you want some numbers you can crunch. So we need these numbers on GDP, government spending, utility levels. Can even these numbers be gendered themselves? And so there are those that say that measures of GDP, government spending are themselves gendered, as we'll see. For example, once you start to get numbers about economic activity, there's all kinds of quite tricky conceptual questions you have to deal with, such as the subsistence in the informal sectors. They're both very large one for developing economies. People interested in rural areas, particularly if someone is growing a crop which they're selling and getting cash, then it's quite easy to measure their economic output. But what happens if most of their crop they're simply eating or using in the family somehow, or if they're going off and cutting firewood down, it's never entering the economy. How do you put a value, a price on that? Similarly, in informal sectors, where the whole point, or a lot of the point is, don't let the tax person, the other regulators know what you're doing, how do you get data on that? So a lot of stuff can be invisible and informal. And sometime in the 80s, Tanzanian economists decided that up to a third of the economy had been hidden and informal, and all the GDP figures had to be revised upwards by a third. Other conceptual things: what happens if you marry your housekeeper? What happens to GDP? Maybe pause the video for a second and think, what happens if you marry your housekeeper, or an alternatively sexist one, if you marry your gardener? Well, the idea is in both cases, if you marry your housekeeper, marry your gardener, formal GDP will increase, but in actual fact, no more is being produced because the person, he or she is still being your housekeeper, he or she is still doing the gardening, but now you've married them, instead of paying them, you'd expect them to do it for free, which means my answer was wrong. GDP would go down because you're not paying them to do this stuff, so it's no longer in the books. How would you put a value on domestic labour? Well, okay, you can answer that by paying it. Many feminists and feminist economists have long said that domestic labour and housework done by men and women should be valued somehow and entered into national accounts. But how would you do this? Okay, one sense, you imagine you have to pay someone to do the gardening, the housework, the cooking, the cleaning, the care work. Then you get to decisions such as, would that be a global person? So if I was going to replace my housework, would I have like Delia Smith would be doing the cooking, and Percy Thrower, showing my age, would be the gardening, and so on. So would I get the top expert to do it? But then that would be greatly inflate the price because I'm having experts to do everything. I'm not an expert in any of this stuff. So would you have to somehow work out a kind of average person that can do all that? Or would you just look at opportunity cost? But that's crazy as well, because then my cost of cooking an omelette is valued at the same cost as preparing a lecture or whatever. So again, it'd be totally unrepresentative of the usual economic value of these things. Others said that, well, to accept all this is really to accept the domination of economics as a way of organising social interaction. And really, this should be, it's a matter of social provisioning. People are doing what's socially necessary, but preference maximising isn't really the calculus, the logic you can apply to a lot of these caregiving and domestic labour in any case. And similarly, cultural variation, the same thing in different cultures, can be counted as work or not work. So it's hard to get consistency between different cultures. Those are conceptual. Then what about empirical, practical difficulties? Well, subsistence sector, how do you get the data on, even if you decided how you're going to do it, how do you get data on how much firewood or how much for people's own consumption, own production they're consuming? Touchscreens. Again, informal sector, by definition, it's not on the official registers. People are reluctant to reveal their activities. It's really tough practically to get the data. And domestic labour, even more difficulty, unless you can get people somehow to pay to have a kind of listening device in their homes that tracks everything they do, but that day will obviously never come. So it's really hard to get data. If you do get the data, and this has been done in a number of countries, you can publish a separate set of national accounts that attempts to estimate all the unpaid work that's done by people, by men and women. And when this has been done, typically it comes out to be about a third to a half larger than the normal GDP if you effectively capture unpaid men's and women's work. Critiques are really, this is a distraction, as Cornwall says. It's what you're doing is you're just accepting that men and women are going to have these fixed gendered roles and trying to put numbers on those, which is going to take you a lot of time, a lot of effort. Effort would be much better used in just making it easier for women to enter the market and making men occasionally pick up an iron and do some hoovering. That's what you should put your attention into. Razavi again pushes the idea that in fact non-economic activity has got its own value which can't be reduced to economic terms. And Cornwall says that the whole discussion is just an annoying distraction from the politics and power for Cornwall. I always want to say Patricia Cornwall, but I don't think she is Patricia Cornwall. Some examples of these, which you'll find in the reading list, this is gender satellite accounts is the attempts that people have made to measure actual economic activity. The counterpart of that is gender budgets. It's the effort to measure the gendered effects of macroeconomic policy. So this is like the input to economic activity. So in Tanzania, they've attempted to do gender budgets. As in many of the cases, it started off by NGOs, Tanzania Gender Network Programme, funded by international NGOs, and eventually gained a life of its own, has become quite independent. The UK again was NGO initiated. It's now called the Women's Budget Group. I thoroughly recommend you look them up and follow them on Twitter and on their website. They produce excellent, fine-grained, detailed analysis of the UK budgets and other budgets and other bits of economic policy. So the Women's Budget Group are excellent, and they link to other organisations in other countries. South Africa was excellent, really rose up after the end of apartheid with the increase of women MPs. By the third year after the release of Mandela, after elections, they had the whole national budget analysed, but it was still something that only happened really in the world of activists, didn't really get much into the papers, ordinary people weren't aware of it, and reluctantly it's tended to fade. But by far the biggest was the Australian one in the 90s, when not only the national level, but every state produced extensive gender budgets, analysing the effects of government spending in terms of the differential effects on men and women. The Conservative government under Howard cut it back a lot, and it's come back more recently, but still nothing like it used to be. So this is the website of the world, which is still very vibrant. The international one's not as vibrant as it used to be. This one is a better place to start. So why is gender and economics important to economic outcomes and trade outcomes? Well, it's just inefficient. assuming that ability is distributed equally, if you're only choosing one sex, then you'll clearly have to dive deeper and getting less capable men and putting to one side women who are more capable. Cross-country regression evidence seems to suggest that comparing the relatively better performance of East Asia with Sub-Saharan Africa, which is a big difference, going back over to the years of independence in the 60s, about 15 to 20% of this enormous difference stands out in the figures as being down to differences in gender equality. I mentioned this already. Okay, the quote was Marianne Lofton. Warren Buffett invest like a girl, and why you should too. The Lehman Sisters hypothesis. So please have a read of that one. And many studies, as we'll find in the next sector, have found links to trade. The next section of this lecture, which we turn to now. So next we take some of these ideas and apply them to the area of gender and look at evidence at two levels.